The last thing I saw before my cheek struck the cold slate of the kitchen floor was the glint of my own husband's wedding ring on my son's hand, the one I'd given him when his own finances had imploded. The last thing I heard was his voice, a sound warped by a fury I didn't recognize, sharp as shattered glass. "We are not running a hospice, Mother. Get out!" Then a brief, merciful darkness, punctuated only by the tittering sound of my heart medication scattering like tiny broken teeth across the floorboards of the home he now claimed as his. My son Julian stood over me, his face a grotesque mask of crimson rage, his chest heaving. His wife, Cassandra, hovered in the periphery, a phantom pretending to organize a stack of mail, her silence a form of applause. I remained motionless, my trembling fingers not a symptom of fear, but of the familiar creeping ache that snaked up my left arm whenever a dose of my medication was late. The little amber bottle, my lifeline, lay on its side, a casualty of his tantrum having rolled to a stop just under the lip of the stainless steel refrigerator. A few of the small white pills were strewn across the dark grout lines like fallen stars. I stared at them, my vision blurring before slowly, painfully pushing myself to my knees, one hand braced against the cabinet for support. No sound escaped my lips, no groan of pain, no whimper of despair. I had learned over these last few years that my sounds were an inconvenience. Julian had already turned his back on me, a final act of dismissal. As my fingers closed around the cool plastic of the bottle, a memory surged unbidden and unwelcome, settling like a stone in my gut. I was 31 and a widow, working as a research librarian at the university, a quiet life of cataloging the stories of others while desperately trying to write a hopeful one for my own son. I remembered the weight of exhaustion as I'd sorted through interlibrary loan requests late into the night, the extra shifts taken just to afford the deposit on his first apartment near the Oregon coast. I remembered selling my own collection of first editions, books that were like old friends, so he could have a reliable car for his new job. I remembered every quiet sacrifice, every skipped meal, every ignored ache. All of it laid at the altar of his future. I had given him the entire library of my life, and now he was calling me a leech? An expired text to be discarded? I had known the narrative was shifting for months. The change began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a muttered comment under his breath when I took too long to answer a question, the delicate, theatrical sigh from Cassie whenever I entered a room. Then came the decisions made in hushed tones behind closed doors, from which I was excluded. My belongings were moved from the airy upstairs guest room, the one with the view of the bay, to the damp, cramped room in the basement next to the rumbling furnace. It was for the children, they'd explained. They needed a playroom. They unplugged the small television in my room, citing the need to cut down on electricity costs, even as a new wall-sized screen appeared in their living room. "At your age, Cassie," it said with a smile that never reached your eyes, "do you really need the heater on all night?" Each new indignity was presented as a practical necessity, a slow, methodical erasure of my presence. I was too noisy when I had my book club over, then too distant when I began declining invitations. I was too opinionated when I commented on the news, then too withdrawn when I fell silent at the dinner table. It was a game with rules that changed daily, a game I could never win, so I stopped playing. I had moved in with them after my husband Arthur passed away. A sudden aneurysm had stolen him from me in the quiet of a Sunday morning, leaving a void that echoed in every corner of the house we had shared for 40 years. Julian had insisted I come live with them in the charming coastal town of Newport. It would be good for everyone, he'd argued. I could help with my grandchildren, he'd be able to keep an eye on me, and we'd all save money. It sounded like love at the time. I believed it was, and for a while it worked. I kept to my corner of the house, helped where I was asked, and paid for all the groceries and utilities with my librarian's pension. Though they never explicitly asked, I was their silent, willing benefactor. When the septic system failed, I wrote the check without a second thought. When Cassie's car needed a new transmission, I covered the bill. I was happy to do it. Family helps family. That was a truth I held to be self-evident. When they found the house, a beautiful but dilapidated Victorian overlooking the water, it was far beyond their means. Their credit was a ruin of student debt and a failed investment in some artisanal coffee venture. The bank wouldn't even look at their application. They needed someone with perfect credit and substantial assets. They needed me. I offered to co-sign, believing it was a simple formality to help them build their life. My name went on the mortgage. More importantly, my name and my name alone went on the deed. It was a detail the banker had insisted upon, given their financial instability. This way, Mrs. Vance, the property is secured by you and only by you, he'd explained. We can add them later. They never asked to be added. They were too busy, too self-assured, too certain I would never leave them, too certain I had nowhere else to go. Now, years later, my son stood in the kitchen of the house that was, in the unblinking eyes of the law, entirely mine, screaming at me as if I were a stray cat he was trying to shoo from the porch. You act like we owe you something, he spat, his back still to me. We took you in. We gave you a roof over your head. That should be enough. A jolt went through me, straightening my spine. It wasn't pride. It was the ingrained composure of a woman who had managed the hushed chaos of a university library for 40 decades. I never asked you to take me in, Julian, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He scoffed, finally turning to raid the refrigerator for a can of soda. Oh, please, what were you going to do? Rattle around in that old house in Portland until you die? You think because you bought a few groceries and watched the kids a couple of times, you get to live here forever? That was it. The moment of chilling clarity. He had either forgotten about the mortgage, the deed, and the tens of thousands of dollars I had poured into this house, or he had willingly written history to suit his narrative. In this new version, I was a tenant, a burden, a charity case. Everything I had done before was irrelevant, footnotes in a story he was actively editing. I screwed the cap back on my pill bottle, the small click loud in the tense silence. If you want me to leave, all you have to do is say so. He looked me dead in the eye, the first real eye contact of the morning. Fine, he said, his voice flat and cold. We're tired of walking on eggshells around you. We have plans for this house. We could rent out your room to someone who actually contributes. I gave a single, slow nod. Behind him, Cassie drifted into the room, her phone held aloft as if documenting the moment. She offered me a sliver of a smile, the triumphant smirk of someone who has just won a silent, protracted war. I turned away from them both, my bare feet cold on the slate, and walked to my room. Not the one upstairs with the view of the sea, but the one in the basement next to the furnace that always smelled of dust and damp. I opened the single drawer of the small nightstand I'd brought from my old home and pulled out a worn leather portfolio. Inside, protected by a plastic sleeve, was the original notarized copy of the deed. My name, Eleanor Vance, stood alone. They had never bothered to look. I placed the portfolio into my suitcase, then I walked back upstairs. They were still in the kitchen, affecting an air of casual indifference. I moved with a deliberate, almost glacial calm. I filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and waited for the water to boil. Julian watched me, his eyes narrowed. What are you doing? Making tea. You don't have to be so dramatic. Just pack your things. A faint smile touched my lips. I will, I said softly. Tomorrow. I sat at the small kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the steam curl into the air. I sipped slowly, my gaze unwavering. I didn't flinch when he swore under his breath and stormed out of the room. I didn't react when Cassie muttered, "See, this is what I mean, always making things so awkward." I just sipped my tea, because I knew that by breakfast I would be gone, and by dinner, so would the roof over their heads. There's a small fireproof safe bolted to the floor in the back of my closet, tucked behind a row of winter coats. It's rusted at the hinges and coated in a fine layer of dust, a relic from another life. It was Arthur's. After he died, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. I moved it from our home in Portland to this basement room, a silent guardian of things I once believed were only for emergencies. That morning, I understood this was the emergency he had always quietly prepared me for. The basement light flickered erratically, but I didn't need it. My fingers knew the way. I knelt and found the small key taped to the underside of my dresser, right where I'd put it years ago. That night, for the first time in years, I slept with the window open, breathing in the clean, lake-scented air without fear, without the crushing weight of being unwelcome in my own life. And I dreamed not of what I had lost, but of what I had finally, irrevocably taken back. The rain began in the afternoon, drumming against the roof of Bee's cottage with a steady rhythm that felt both cleansing and somber. My phone started ringing just after 3. Julian. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again and again, the calls punctuated by angry text messages. "What is this joke, Mom? You've lost your mind. We took care of you, and this is how you repay us." That word again, repay, as if their tolerance was a currency I had failed to earn. By evening, the messages had devolved from rage to pleading, and then finally to a wounded silence. I turned off my phone and placed it in a drawer. They appeared at Bee's front door the next morning, looking haggard and soaked from the rain. Bee opened the door, a formidable figure in her gardening apron. "We're looking for Eleanor," Julian demanded, his voice raw. "She's not here," Bee replied calmly, "and even if she was, she has no interest in being yelled at on my porch." "She's our mother," he roared. Bee blinked slowly, her expression unreadable. "You remember that now, do you?" They didn't come back. A week later, a sheriff's deputy posted the final notice on the front door of the house they believed was theirs. 30 days. It was more grace than they had ever afforded me. They tried to fight it, of course.